All right, next up, cancer and obesity. It isn't breaking news that obesity is linked to a whole host of negative health outcomes, nor that those health outcomes combine to a substantially greater risk of death at any given moment. But researchers in Spain have added even more clarity around the link between being obese and cancer. So this article was in the New York Post. It said in all 13 types of the disease, that being cancer, were previously known to be associated with overweight body types, but now that number has climbed to 18 different cancers. And the risk of developing cancer begins when people are young, between the ages of 18 and 40. The researchers looked at the electronic health records of more than 2.6 million people in Catalonia, Spain. The people were 40 years old or older in 2009 and were then free of cancer. But in 2018, just 9 years later, over 225,000 of the people, study participants, had been diagnosed with cancer. That's almost 9% if you want to do the math. The researchers also sorted the data by including decades of the participants' health records showing a BMI of 25 or greater, which indicates that a person may be overweight or obese. The results of the study, published in Nature Communications, revealed that having a BMI of 25 or greater led to a greater risk of developing 18 different types of cancers. Specifically, the researchers found that those who were overweight in early adulthood, between the ages of 18 and 40, had an increased risk of cancer. The people who were overweight or obese for a longer period of time also had a higher risk of developing cancer. Finally, those with a much higher degree of obesity in their youth had a greater risk of cancer. In addition, the additional types, additional to the 13 that were previously known, the additional types of cancer that the researchers linked to obesity or being overweight were leukemia, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, head and neck cancers, and bladder cancer. And for those curious, the original 13 were endometrial, esophageal, gastric, cardia, liver, kidney, multiple myeloma, meningioma, I can't say that word, meningioma, there we go, I'll get it eventually, pancreatic, colorectal, gallbladder, breast cancers, ovarian, and thyroid. So that's a long list of most of the major cancers out there. If I understood that right, the younger you are, the younger you become overweight or obese, the longer you stay overweight and obese, the more overweight or obese you are, the greater your risk of cancer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Wow. So, one more reason piling on here that tackling this issue is super, super important.
Yeah, like we see with, hypertension, hyperlipidemia are just the two that come to mind.
Right.
That's why there's much more push to intervene earlier with those as well.
Yeah.
Because it's not just it's not just your blood work in and of itself or your one blood pressure reading. It's just it's those exposures over time.
Right. It's not that you were overweight for 1 month, therefore it doesn't matter, damage is done. It's the longer you are in that status, the more of that status you experience. Okay, so as I was reading that article and the others associated, one of the things they kept talking about is associated with a risk of. It was not saying causal.
Yes.
What is this differentiation? And we've talked about it before. What is the differentiation between association and causal linkage?
I'm not a biostatistics expert by any stretch, but those distinctions come down to the specific study designs that are employed. And so in this case, there's no real randomization that can occur, for example. So they didn't necessarily take these individuals at birth and randomize them to obese versus not obese, and then they followed them in that way. So from my understanding and my interpretation of this kind of conversation is that how you interpret the causality or the correlation simply comes back to what study design is being used. This is not a this is not a randomized control trial in which you have a placebo group and a active group. It is just different. So then, and that doesn't render the association that's made, it doesn't render it useless in any way. It's just that you have to then zoom out. Are there other papers kind of corroborating what's being said here? Are there mechanistic studies that are corroborating what's happening here? Or is there a whole subset of things saying the exact opposite?
Right.
So and then it also comes down to how well that this study, how well was the individual study or this individual meta-analysis done?
Right.
How effective were they in, actually answering the question that they were asking? So it's a long answer to say that even though they're not using the word causation
right.
in this context, it still means a whole heck of a lot because of everything else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So even though they're not using causal language, it is not something that can be ignored in the same sense that 100% of people who get in car accidents drink water. That makes no sense. There's tons of other data showing that has nothing to do with that. There's no other correlation there. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't make it a causal link. This is something where there's enough evidence repeated over enough periods of time with enough studies and all these things that we can fairly confidently say this isn't we're not calling it a causal link, but it sure looks like, it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the Washington Post says, experts note that being overweight or obese does not mean that someone will definitely get cancer, but rather that a cancer diagnosis is more likely than if a person had maintained a healthier weight. The CDC says, in addition to not smoking, keeping a healthy weight is one of the most important steps people can take to lower their risk for cancer.
Right.
For some people, this is like, you could read all the warning signs, stop signs, wrong way, don't go this way, do not enter. And people, like, what is it that's going to make somebody actually change to do? Like, people like to smoke. It's a way to cope. It's a stress reliever. People like to eat. Same thing.
Right.
Pain reliever or stress reliever, an escape. I just don't know, like, how many headlines like this are we going to read about lower obesity is lower cancer risk, and people still.
That's ultimately why the GLP-1 agonists, all these medications that are on the market now, have provided such an interesting alternative, an interesting, take on managing and treating diseases related to increased adiposity, because it's more than just there's of course the behavioral implication, but now we have medications that can help totally turn the behavioral component on its head.
Right.
So that in lies the problem, is that there's probably going to be more and more and more and more as far as associative links to cancer and various disease states with obesity. And that's still not going to be enough to drive any sort of change. I mean, you look at smoking and tobacco, all of these, policies had to go into place for things to start to change there.
Right.
There's still plenty of issues there.
Right.
And not saying that that's the same sort of circumstance, but it is just further highlights how complicated all of this is, really.